Thank you, sir. Well, I dressed up so that you could kind of see what the uniform would look like, but it's coming off. This is wool. Now, who can tell me why the Union uniforms were wool instead of cotton? Well,
because of the South cotton.
that's right. Cotton came from the South, and when they attacked the North, that kind of cut off the supply. So, anyway, fun little tidbit. This is a presentation that was originally put together by Polly Horn, who's our longtime curator at the museum, at the Myers Stagecoach Inn and Museum there in Sunbury, off the square. And I have significantly altered and edited it for presentations such as this. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about George M. Wise. He was in the 43rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiment that served under General Rosecrans. And he was the adjutant, which was basically the guy that did all the paperwork, drafted the orders, took care of the prisoners, and did all the stuff nobody else wanted to do. A regiment usually was about 1,000 men, 10 companies, 100 men each. So it was a lot to keep track of. This is a portrait of one of our major battles, the Battle of Corinth, Mississippi, and where we participated in that along with about 42 other major battles. Our regiment was organized at Mount Vernon in late 1861 and early 1862. The men from Belmont, Delaware, Knox, and all those other surrounding counties made up the regiment. You'll notice Delaware. Captain Wise was from Belmont County, and that's where my ancestors were from over that area before they moved to southern Ohio. Our regiment was known for its discipline and saw intense action in the Western theater. And despite all the hype that everything was won in the Eastern theater in Virginia and everywhere, we won the Civil War, but that's another story. We were attached to the Army of the Mississippi under General William Stark Rosecrans and later under Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, and made the march to the sea with him and did a little urban renewal on the way. Our Lieutenant Colonel received the Congressional Medal of Honor, and so that tells you a little bit about our operation. That is our national colors and our regimental flag, which is in the Ohio Historical Society, but it's in terrible shape. That's what it should look like. The 43rd saw 46 Western battles and engagements, including Corinth, Iuka, Atlanta, Resaca, on and on. A lot of the big ones. Okay, let's get to General Rosecrans. William was born in Kingston Township, Delaware County. Unfortunately, the home where he was born was destroyed, so all we have there is a monument on what's now called Rosecrans Road. And if you drive past this, don't be surprised if you drive right past it because it's very easy to miss. So you have to go kind of slow to see this. The family moved when he was about 2 years old to Homer over in Licking County. This was the home there. That's a turn of the century, 19th to 20th century picture that was in the Newark Advocate. The house was built in about 1825. Now, the family had no money for college. They were dirt poor like most folks of that time. But they heard about West Point. West Point stressed history, the military, mathematics, and engineering. It offered a free education to those recommended. You had to be recommended by a congressperson or some other dignitary like that. Rosecrans and his father began a correspondence with their congressman, Alexander Harper. Well, 3.5 months went by with no reply. So they took the bull by the horns, as the Rosecrans were known to do, and applied directly to Secretary of War Lewis Cass, who approved his appointment pending passing the entrance examination that he took at Kenyon College. Now, to kind of backtrack a little bit, William was really smart. He was sickly as a child and had to largely self-educate, but he did so with gusto, and so that's how he was well prepared to go into West Point. Entered in 1838, they were sectioned by ability, and he was placed in a superior group. They nicknamed him Rosie or Old Rosie. The Rosie part kind of stuck in the military after that, but he never allowed anyone to call him something like Willie. He graduated from West Point in the class of 1842. He was fifth in his class of 56, so he did very well. He was breveted as second lieutenant and was assigned to the Corps of Engineers. Now, at that time, and really now, that was a very prestigious assignment. You couldn't get a better assignment than being assigned to the Corps of Engineers. So that again shows his intelligence. He was sent to Hampton Roads in Virginia to work on fortifications. Now, you'll recognize some of these names of his classmates. About half of them were Union and half of them were what we call rebels or Confederates. George Sykes was from Delaware. And he was a major general in the U.S. Army. He taught at West Point from 1843 to 47. And that made him miss the Mexican War. They needed him more there teaching those cadets than they needed him on the line. He was an assistant professor of engineering. And an assistant professor of natural and experimental philosophy. And he was the principal assistant professor of engineering. So he was an engineer. With the Corps of Engineers, Rosecrans surveyed harbors and engineered improvements for the government from 1843 to 1853. Now, along the way, in youth, he was baptized as a Wesleyan Methodist. But at West Point, all cadets were expected to attend the Episcopalian services. Well, being a young man, inquisitive, he kind of researched some other things, and the Transcendentalist movement was going on at that time, so he kind of looked into that for a little while. But then an Irish book peddler came along and told him about the Catholic Church. And in 1844, Rosecrans read John Milner's The End of Religious Controversy and converted to Roman Catholicism. We have a copy of this book at our museum in Sunbury. He carried on a long correspondence with the Pope of that time, Pope Pius IX. Well, his health began to fail, and so Rosecrans requested military leave but was refused. The Secretary of War at that time was Jefferson Davis, and Davis granted him 3 months' leave instead. Well, in March of 1853, Rosecrans resigned to secure rest and make a choice of a civil career to support his family, noted his wife. Now, you have to understand, military doesn't pay very well, not even in these days. And he was starting a family, and they had military barracks, which, not great housing. And so he decided to leave and strike out on his own and use some of his resources and intelligence. Well, he got involved in the kerosene oil business, among some other things that he was involved in, and he was quite the inventor and experimenter. He has several patents to his name. And he was working on a safer, cleaner kerosene lamp fuel by adding paraffin. That also slowed the rate of fire down so it was more economical. Well, unfortunately, in one of his experiments, the lamp exploded and put him in bed for like 18 months. And it severely scarred his right face. That's why you don't see a lot of photographs of him from the right portrait side. So those retained scars, leaving him with what some people call a permanent smirk. 10 June 1861, he became commander of the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry as colonel. And he changed the name from Camp Jackson to Camp Chase, which is right there in Columbus. Then he became a brigadier general in the regular army. So you have to understand there were two different segments. There was the regular army, which was very small. At the beginning of the Civil War, there were about 7,000 men, roughly 1,000 to 1,500 officers. When the war came along, they knew we got to get big and we got to get big fast. And so they were looking for men that had experience to be the officers in the regular army, and so they very quickly promoted him to brigadier general in the regular army. 28 June 1861, commissioned the brigadier general, and he was under Major General George McClellan in the western part of Virginia. The affair of Rich Mountain, well, that was in Virginia in the early days of the war, and the rebels were trying to sweep up through the valley there and maybe even cross the Ohio River and bring the war up that way. 11 July 1861, our army ascended the mountain in the rain, and there were no officers with those guys who knew how to manage men. Now, you got to remember, the people that volunteered were shop clerks, farmers, lawyers, doctors. They didn't know anything about leading men. Well, Rosecrans won that battle with his courage, his strategy, and his military intelligence, trusting nothing to subordinates. This was one of those cases where he did everything pretty much on his own until he got everybody trained the way he wanted them. Now, as you will see through this presentation, the guys upstream had a propensity to take credit for something their subordinates should have gotten credit for. And so in this case, McClellan wrote the report and took all the credit for this. And so that's one of the reasons I'm here, is to help set the record straight. Virginia broke apart, and as you know, by 1863, it became our 34th state. Had it not been for McClellan's kicking Robert E. Lee's tush out of Western Virginia, who knows how that would have turned out. On 25 July 1861, Rosecrans replaced McClellan and was in charge of the Western Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Illinois. His headquarters was in Clarksburg, which was still Virginia at that point. He fortified the Red House, Cheat Mountain, and Elkwater passes. Now, you may have heard this, but a lot of people said, oh, the war's going to be over in just a few months. In fact, men rushed to enlist because they wanted to get into the glory before it all was over with. We know 4 years later and 750,000 casualties, that was not the case. So, at this point in the war, 3-month enlistments were ending, and the new soldiers were pretty green. And without officers that knew what they were doing, they were doomed to fail. So, what Rosecrans did is he suggested that the West Point Military Academy send one cadet for each regiment to act as drill master and instructor. I think that was a pretty smart move. But he personally continued to inspect and train the men himself. And I thought this was kind of funny, using crackers at the dinner table to give lessons on outpost and picket duty. William McKinley. Now, this is much later, 1896, at an address to the veterans in Canton, Ohio. But he talks of this period that we just talked about. McKinley said, "We had a great regiment, great in its field officers, great in the character of the rank and file that constituted it. Our hearts go out with tenderness and love, I am sure, to the first colonel of our regiment, General William S. Rosecrans, to his distant home in California." And there was great applause once McKinley said that. "We all remember his splendid discipline and gentle qualities, and we remember him with what pride we marched under his command in West Virginia in 1861. Now, there was a rough winter that time of year, and as the commanders are wont to do, they moved around the chess pieces, and they cut his troops from 22,000 down to 2,000. And as fate would have it, it was an extremely cold winter with lots of heavy snow. Boy, that sounds kind of familiar. Whoops, wrong button. There we go. Well, he organized a mule train to transport supplies over the mountains. Typhoid hit 300 of his men. Rosecrans had the sense of mind to move them out of the crowded quarters to clean hospital tents. Pretty soon, he only had 30 ill soldiers. And he designed the Army's ambulance, adding springs, medical supply drawers, benches, and cot space. That's a picture of what is known as the Wheeling or Rosecrans ambulance wagon. Now, we have a wagon in Sunbury that we're going to trot out for the July 4th celebration, but unfortunately it's not this. It's similar, but we're going to have a team of horses pull it in the parade, and so we invite you all to come over and see that if you get the opportunity. He commands the troops in Corinth, Mississippi. This is a portrait of our regiment's defense of Battery Robinette on 4 October 1862. And that is the Texas Regiment coming up trying to capture our cannons, and we beat them off. House Speaker Henderson recalled that day. He, being Rosecrans, suddenly dashed between the Federal and Confederate lines like the very spirit of war. He passed but a few steps in front of where I was. I can feel his presence yet. His hat had blown off. His firmly set face seemed as though he was made as a god of battle. Swinging his sword, he called out to us, "Stand by your flag and country, my men." How he escaped, God only knows. It seemed as though the very air was full of lead, and death was holding high carnival along his pathway. And yet fearless he rode into the very teeth of death, rallying successfully his men for the mighty struggle before them. That splendid, fearless, heroic dash was the death knell to the armies of Price and Van Dorn, the Confederates. Now, in this battle, his aide was right beside him, and a cannonball hit him right between the eyes and decapitated him. And the blood, I don't mean to be gory, but the blood splattered over onto Rosecrans. And yet he had the presence of mind to continue to lead the men. And he was a good friend with Gershom. It was a costly Union victory, particularly for our regiment. We lost most of our officers, and a quarter of our regiment were killed or wounded. Now, this was before my ancestor was adjutant at that time. The Mississippi campaigns that Rosecrans ran gained more respect for him. He was esteemed in the South as one of the best generals the North had in the field. He was declared by military critics who could not be accused of partiality to have clearly out-generaled Lee, who made the entire object of his campaign to surround the Dutch general, meaning Rosecrans. Rosecrans' family was originally Dutch. That's from Southern History of the War, 1865. On 22 October 1862, Rosecrans wrote to his wife, "The Confederates have a wholesome regard for me, praise very highly the style of our troops and the tactics on the field of battle. They're more afraid of me than any other general in the service." A little bit of self-serving there. But that was old Rosie. He became commander of the Cumberland, Department of Cumberland. 22 October 1862 was sent to replace Buell over Thomas. Supplies were again low and non-existent, and he appointed John W. Taylor as quartermaster and Samuel Simmons as commissary because he had faith in those guys fixing the problem. But he also faced low morale, high absenteeism, pillaging, and drunken officers. I might add, a lot of the officers were professional officers as opposed to the volunteers. Well, he mustered those bad guys out. He said, "Get out of here." He increased the frequency of effective brigade drills, increased the number of chaplains, and he needed eyes and ears and men that would go out and forage since they didn't have all the supplies they needed. And so he established a cavalry unit under General David Stanley. He also reorganizes several things. He organized an African-American pioneer brigade. These were the guys that would go out and do the grunt work of building trenches and parapets and fortifications and things like that. But he also built a tent city hospital near Murfreesboro. He used the cavalry reconnaissance and civilian informers to upgrade their maps. Their maps were in terrible shape. He reorganized the Army signal and telegraph system, organized a directory post for lost wounded that were separated from their regiments so they could go there and figure out, hey, how do I get back to my regiment? And this was a real important thing for the men. They were getting their mail days, if not weeks, late. If you're a clerk, you've never been more than 5 miles away from home, and you're 600 miles away, and you're the breadwinner for your family, and your money needs to get to your family, and you desperately want to find out how your sweetheart's doing, how your kids are doing, mail is extremely important. He fixed that problem with daily deliveries of mail. I don't know how he did it, but he did. And being a very religious person, we'll get to that in a little bit, he encouraged all to attend services of their faith of choice. This is a book about the Tullahoma campaign. You don't hear much about this, but this was a real important campaign. Any student of military art who desires to make a study of a model campaign, let him take the maps and General Rosecrans' orders for daily movements of this campaign. No better example of successful strategy was carried out during the war than in the Tullahoma campaign. General David Stanley, his cavalry officer. 24 June through 7 July 1863, Rosecrans drove Confederate General Bragg out of Middle Tennessee in the least bloody of any major victory of the war. There were only 83 Union killed, 473 wounded, and 13 captured or missing. 1,634 rebels were captured. I've got 2 or 3 slides here on the Battle of Chickamauga because this is where the record starts going south for Rosecrans. He won every battle except this one. And this was the excuse to basically cashier him out and get rid of him, which we'll explain here in a little bit. So I've got 2 or 3 slides because this is really important. It was in southeastern Tennessee and northwestern Georgia. The largest tactical rebel victory in the West, but a strategic failure because they didn't go ahead and pursue the ultimate objective, which was to capture Chattanooga. If they captured Chattanooga, that was a very important supply place, and they could have then moved on up further north. The Confederate forces outnumbered the Federals there. The Union Army did not expect to engage there. And there was command confusion, and as fate would have it, rebel just-in-time reinforcements enabled Confederate victory. Bragg was the commander, and he called for reinforcements from the Army of Virginia. And General James Longstreet, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, came off the trains from Virginia with 12,000 reinforcements, just at the right time. And what happened was he split the Union lines right in two because he was at the right place at the right time. The Union division commander, General Wood, received ambiguous orders from Rosecrans, and he didn't seek clarification. That resulted in this huge gap being opened in the line because they were thinking they were closing a gap somewhere else, but what they actually did is they opened a gap, and Longstreet plunged right on through with his 12,000 troops. That caused a retreat, a lot of confusion. Well, Rosecrans fell back to secure Chattanooga because he knew that was probably what the Confederates were up to. But as history has been wrongly written, they said he fled in panic back to Chattanooga. Not true. General Thomas, who would retain the reputation of the Rock of Chickamauga, remained to protect Rosecrans' withdrawal. And he was rightly lauded for his work there in making a bad situation not completely catastrophic. So, the history books say it was a Union defeat, but Braxton Bragg did not pursue Rosecrans, and so that turned the Southern victory into a strategic defeat. This gave Ulysses S. Grant, general in charge of the armies at that point, the excuse that he was looking for, which we'll talk about a little later, to relieve Rosecrans as commander of the Army of the Cumberland. Rosecrans was told to return to Cincinnati and await orders. That was his home base where his wife lived at that point of the war. Now, here's some interesting comments from the other guys. Meantime, Lincoln is helping us. He has removed from command the most dangerous man in his army and put 2 fools in his place. A variety of mean and damaging pretexts for Rosecrans' removal have been published by the Yankee press. But the true reason is that he failed at Chickamauga, and the abolitionist government adheres to its system of dismissing every general who incurs defeat. Now, you may remember Lincoln went through generals like toilet paper. I mean, it was just, he couldn't find the right guy to run the thing until he came up with Grant. So, what did Rosecrans do with his spare time there? Well, he helped organize the Great Western Sanitary Fair. This was back before we had the Red Cross or anything like that, and so they were just figuring out, we need to do something for these men who are wounded. And so they raised funds for what had been established as the Sanitary Commission to improve the living conditions for soldiers. They didn't know anything about germs, but they knew that cleanliness was next to godliness. And so Elizabeth Mendenhall organized the fair. Rosecrans served as president over it, so he brought a lot of credibility to. It was held in Cincinnati in October of 1863. That's a picture of the poster advertising it. The event raised over $250,000. That's like $6.5 million in today's dollars. Tremendous. He finally got another command as the Department of Missouri Commandant. This is, as I mentioned, there are very few pictures of him on the right side. This is one of them. 22 January 1864, he went to St. Louis and found troops had been cut to 16,900 from 68,400. It was almost like they were trying to set him up for failure again. Slaves were continued to be discreetly sold there in St. Louis, with traders sending them to the auctions in Kentucky. On 1st of March, Rosecrans ordered those sales stopped. He vehemently argued against slavery. In April, the Mississippi Valley Sanitary Fair in St. Louis raised $700,000 after Rosecrans convinced the people there that raffles were not gambling. He had to keep General Price out of St. Louis, so with the fact he only had about 17,000 men, he recruited just about anybody he could, any way he could. On 22 June, Rosecrans had been informed of a plot against Lincoln to assassinate him by the American Knights. And so he sent that upstream to Lincoln's administration. I think they pretty much ignored it, but fortunately nothing happened at that point. Okay, the slide you've been waiting for. Wanted, Rosecrans for president. Horace Greeley, New York Tribune editor, inquired if Rosecrans would run as the Republican nominee in 1864 instead of Lincoln, because they thought, Lincoln's not going to get reelected. We're going to have to do somebody else. And in classic Rosecrans style, he replied, Lincoln's the right man for the job. I am trained for the military. Later, Republicans wanted a soldier and war Democrat to balance the Union Party ticket with Lincoln. Now, just an aside about the Union Party. Part of the Republican strategy for re-election was to start a new party called the Union Party, which would be made up of what was called war Democrats, those who supported the war, and the Republicans. And so to try to make this more palatable, they called it the Union Party. And so they designed this Union Party, and that's how Lincoln ran, was on the Union Party ticket for re-election. Well, enter James A. Garfield into the picture. Garfield was a general on the staff of General Rosecrans, but he was also elected as a congressman from Ohio, and he was a bigwig in this new Union Party, particularly because Ohio had the most delegates to that nominating convention of theirs. So he strongly influenced the 1864 Union Party convention. In June of 1864, Garfield telegraphed Rosecrans offering the vice president slot to Rosecrans. Well, Rosecrans was a Democrat, so that fit the bill, Republican and Democrat running mate. Catholic, he'd bring in the Catholic vote. Well loved by his men. He would bring in the military vote. Brilliant. He sent back a 2-page, long, flowery, well, if it's the will of the people, blah. All he had to do was basically say, yeah, I'll do it. However, because he was in the military, all telegrams went through the War Office. Secretary of Stanton, who we'll see here in a little bit, hated Rosecrans by this time in the war. Rosecrans had a mouth on him, and he did not pull punches when he was talking to his superiors. And the Secretary of War, Stanton, was a lawyer from Steubenville, Ohio, who thought he was the smartest guy in the room. And he didn't care for Rosecrans' approach. So that was enemy number one. Enemy number two was Grant. Henry Halleck was another one of his enemies that he didn't like. And so we think what happened is that Stanton likely intercepted Rosecrans' acceptance and presumably destroyed it. Well, when Garfield never heard back from Rosecrans, he just assumed he wasn't interested. And he picked Andrew Johnson as a running mate. And we'll talk about him a little bit later. 10 December 1864, Rosecrans is sent to Cincinnati to await orders again. He was breveted Major General of the regular Army. Breveted means it's kind of a temporary promotion or honorary promotion. 13 March 1865, he still has no assignment. He asked President Johnson for a Pacific Coast assignment because he was very interested in mining. He wanted to study and report on the mining potential. The assignment was denied. He asked for a leave of absence, and that was granted 28 May 1865. President Johnson, Southern Democrat, nominal Methodist, opposed secession, and was drunk at his inaugural. He initially demonstrated considerable courage, commitment, but overall his presidency was considered very ineffective. He strongly supported states' rights and white supremacy and allowed former Confederates to regain power quickly. He was at odds with the Republican Congress and had a tumultuous presidency as a result. He vetoed the 1866 Civil Rights Act and the Freedmen's Bureau Bill. He was impeached, the very first one to be impeached. And he was saved from removal from office by one solitary vote in the Senate. President Rosecrans. Catholic, Democrat, impeccable moral reputation, despite being outspoken, quarrelsome, and pompous. He opposed the beastly institution of slavery, initially opposed abolitionist tactics, but attained a reputation as an abolitionist. He favored enlisting black soldiers, Southern reforms to protect former slaves, proven military and business reputation for innovative thinking, effective programs, and efficient implementation. He ended up being a congressman in California. He was pragmatic and focused on economic development, infrastructure, and of course, Veterans Affairs. We can only wish he would have been a great president. The Great Decliner. 1865, he refused to run for governor of Ohio on the Union Party ticket. 1867, he refused to run for California governor on the Democrat ticket. 1867, he refused the directorship of the San Francisco Mint. 1869, he refused to run as a Republican for Ohio governor. Same year, he refused the Democratic run for Ohio governor. When have you heard, both parties after him? So that's the kind of guy he was. 1876, he refused a congressional candidacy in Nevada. Again in 76, he refused the candidacy for the mayor of San Francisco. Biographer William Lamar said, "It seems certain that had Rosecrans run, he would have been elected to legal or to high office, but each time the promise of some business venture caused him to refuse." He was appointed to Minister of Mexico, 7 July 1868 by President Johnson. He had big plans. He knew that Mexico needed peace and immigration and railroads to succeed. He applied to build a railway and a telegraph from Tampico to the coast. But waiting for financial backers and politicians to act sunk the project. President Grant was elected, terminated his appointment in June of '69. Rosecrans then did run. He was persuaded to run for Congress from California. 1880 was when he was elected to District 197 in San Francisco. His family that was living with him there, he was 61 at this time, was a civil mining engineer by this time in his career. His wife Anna, his daughter Lily, and his son Carl, who was his personal secretary at that time. He was reelected to Congress in 1882 and became chairman of the Military Affairs Committee, which was a really important committee in Congress. He opposed Grant's retirement bill, calling it a proposition to reward Grant for his distinguished military service, something he just could not vote for, because when true history is written, Grant's service will be pared down to a very different dimension. And 100 and some years later, we're trying to correct that lionization of General Grant, as good as he was. President Grover Cleveland appointed Rosecrans Register of the Treasury, which is like Secretary of Treasury these days, 8 June 1885. Probably can't see that, but that's Martha Washington on there. That's the very first time a woman was on any of our currency, and General Rosecrans was responsible for that. We have one of these in our display case, and it's a little tiny banknote. He was placed on the retired list of Civil War soldiers 2 March 1889. That's his signature on the back of this particular photograph. You can almost read his writing. The 1892 Grand Army Encampment was held in Washington, and they had a tent with all the soldiers there reuniting, and the electric lights failed. Remember, this was a fairly new technology. Former President Hayes introduced him, but Rosecrans was only able to speak in low tones because of his age and failing health. When the crowd shouted they wished to see their general, Hayes lit a match and held it close to Rosecrans' face so they could see him. Innovation. A roar of applause shook the tent. It was to be his soldiers' last public salute to their beloved commander. William Stark Rosecrans died 11 March 1898 in Redondo Beach, California. Many of the generals flocked to California for the weather after the war, as did he. That's one of the shortened obituaries for him. His body lay in state in Los Angeles City Hall, his coffin draped with the headquarters flag from Stones River in Chickamauga. Both Union and Confederate generals were his pallbearers. He was originally laid to rest in LA's Rosedale Cemetery, but he now reposes in peace in, fittingly, the Arlington National Cemetery. At the edge of glory, that's kind of a theme. Why at the edge of glory? Well, we've talked a little bit about these antagonists that he had. Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. He was an Ohio Democrat lawyer, served as Attorney General for President Buchanan, disliked Lincoln. Any of you have read Team of Rivals? That's a good book, helps explain a lot of this. He disliked Lincoln, but Lincoln basically surrounded him with his rivals because he knew they were competent. And he replaced Secretary of War Cameron at that time with Stanton to save the country. I don't know if that's why, whether that was because Stanton was so bad or he thought Cameron was so bad or that Stanton was so much better. Anyway, he originally liked Rosecrans, but he resented his ideas and his plans, and he tired of his requests. There's one story that goes around that says that General Halleck had said that Rosecrans sent more telegrams wanting things than all the rest of the Union generals combined. I don't know if that's true or not, but He was not shy at asking for proper supplies. More antagonists. General Grant. That's him writing his memoirs. He finished his memoirs 3 days before he died. He died of throat cancer. His father, Jesse, was implicated in the illegal cotton trade by the Military Inquiry Board that unfortunately had picked Rosecrans to run. Probably a little resentment there. Grant consistently undermined Rosecrans, claiming that he was too slow and he didn't follow orders. Likely had Mark Twain help him write his memoirs. And because they are well done, because they are so well done, historians have fallen into the trap of reading his book as the gospel and not cross-checking it with the official records of the War of Rebellion or other general statements. And shame on them. That's not good history. You need to verify, verify, verify. He scrambled to finish his memoirs, and as I said, he died 3 days after he completed them. More antagonists. Charles A. Dana. He was fired from the New York Tribune, somehow wiggled his way into Stanton's area, hired him as Assistant Secretary of War, had no background in war, to spy on the generals. Reports were often inaccurate, exaggerated, and contradictory. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Wells said he was an intriguer, a hypocrite, and a moral coward. And this one I love. A loathsome pimp, Brigadier General Gordon Granger called him. Not a nice guy. He became Grant's advocate. After the war, he admitted to lying about Rosecrans and apologized to him. The schemer. You hear a lot of good things about our son from Ohio, James A. Garfield, who became president. But he deliberately sacrificed Rosecrans' good name and historical reputation to advance his own military and political career. He falsely reported of Rosecrans' panic at Chickamauga to Stanton. And of course, Stanton, believed it. Apparently otherwise honest, indications he later regretted what he'd done to Rosecrans, who had trusted him as a friend. Rosecrans did not know of Garfield's duplicity until well after the war. The conclusion? William Stark Rosecrans was removed from any further role in the Civil War because people with influence in Washington feared he might be too successful and either be a candidate for the presidency or prevent others, specifically Ulysses S. Grant, from becoming a present or future candidate. He explained how his loyal friend, Thomas, replaced him after Chickamauga, saying history would know what was right and truthful. It's taken a long time to get to that point. He wrote a book called The Mistakes Grant Made. Nobody's ever heard of that. It's buried. Publication of the official war records of the War of Rebellion supports Rosecrans' claims. He distinguished himself on and off the battlefields and cared more for his men than glory. His men loved him. He deserves a touch of glory. Now, over in Sunbury, how many of you have seen the statue over there? We had a unit of volunteers called the Rosecrans Headquarters, and they said, let's build a lasting memorial to the general. Well, 2 years and $176,500 later, we had a statue in Sunbury, on the Sunbury Square, on the town square. Their dream was realized. 27 September 2013, the Big Walnut Area Historical Society dedicated the larger-than-life-size bronze statue of General Rosecrans and his horse, Boney, on a glacial errata on the Sunbury Village Square. So you can learn more about the general at bigwalnuthistory.org. We've got tons of information more than I could ever present about him. And we have our Historical Society meetings every second Tuesday of the month at 7:30. We have a board meeting prior to that, and then we have a program at 7:30 in the Myers Inn and Museum. Okay, well, that was kind of a rapid, whoops, wrong, got the old pocket watch here. Good. That was a very quick presentation. Certainly entertain any questions and try to answer them as best I can.
Is that statue right on the square there?
Yes.
Right there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you're going like on the road that goes on to Johnstown, right there, it's right on the square as you're coming into Sunbury on the main drag there.
It's not on that cemetery. That cemetery is real nice. It's, at certain time of year they...
Right, yeah, it's not at the Sunbury Memorial Park. You come on past that and it's right on the Sunbury Square there. Becky? It is. The mistakes Grant made. I was thinking this other one here. Let me show you it. That is a good question, and I should know the answer to that, but I don't. I'll have to see if I can find that out. This.
Looking it up on A books.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. This is Frank Varney. I've met him, talked with him. He's out in California. And this is what really turned me on to a lot of the misinformation about General Rosecrans. And it's an excellent book. That's what I was thinking we were talking about. But yeah, I'll have to check that out and see if that's available. So, other questions? Sherry?
Would you like to explain a little bit about your relative that was under his command?
Yes. Yeah. They changed structures of command more than we change our socks. And when Rosecrans was in charge of the Army of the Cumberland, my second great uncle was under him in the 43rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiment. And he started out as a buck private. He was a farmer from Belmont County and rose through the ranks. By the end of the war, he was adjutant of the regiment. And after he served, in fact, I've got, let's see what I did with it. It's over here. There are about 26 letters from him that are on file. You can find them on the internet at the Ohio Historical Society. He wrote to his brother, and I have to read this one passage to you of one of his letters. Headquarters 43rd Infantry Ohio Volunteers near Bethel, Tennessee, March 20th, 1863. Dear brother, and he goes into these different things. The news has just arrived that General Rosecrans has been completely overthrown. Whether it is true or not, we cannot yet say, but I fear it is. It seems, according to the report, that the rebels have taken nearly their whole army from Vicksburg and with overwhelming forces have fallen upon Rosecrans. Just like Grant, 2,000 rebels made Grant retreat from Oxford with his army of 100,000. And I have no doubt that 1,000 wooden men set up on the fortifications of Vicksburg would be sufficient to keep his immense army at bay. If Rosecrans has been defeated, it has only been after awful fighting against hopeless odds. And the crime of his defeat rests not with him, but with the men who keep such an old blockhead as Grant in such a position as he now holds. I hope that the report is not true, but whether true or not, it is just what I have been looking for and will look for until it occurs, or Grant is put in some position where his blunders can no longer affect the other generals. Now this is a guy down the trenches, my great uncle, saying that about Grant. So that lends some credibility to what we've been saying here. But yeah, he was quite the man. He was never wounded. He was very fortunate to return and marry his sweetheart when he got back, and he had a passel of kids. was a county commissioner and postmaster, and died a good long life. So, and the way I got involved in this is I was researching General Rosecrans and found out in our history that George M. Wise was in the Union Army, did a little more digging, 43rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Oh, okay. Got to looking at the roster of soldiers, like the 43rd served under General Rosecrans. I was hooked at that point. So, you know, $2,000 later, I got all the accoutrements and decided I was going to play. Unfortunately, we don't have any photographs of him. So I'm kind of, you know, I assume he had a beard, because when you're out in the field, you don't have a lot of time to shave, and you can't say, "Excuse me, Mr. Rebel, don't shoot at me, I'm trying to shave here." So this is kind of a representation as best as I can figure out. Now, I brought a corncob pipe, but actually what he smoked were those hand-rolled cigars, and I think he probably picked that up from Rosecrans, because Rosecrans had a hand-rolled cigar in his mouth all the time. Cuss like a sailor. He would never take the name of the Lord in vain. And I'll tell you a couple other quick stories. There was an artillery battery that was stuck in the mud. It had been raining for days, and unbeknownst to the men that were trying to get it out, Rosecrans got off his horse and helped push. Well, one of the guys said, "I wish that so-and-so Rosecrans would get out here and help us." Well, afterward, one of the other soldiers, "You damn fool, you know who that was?" That was General Rosecrans helping push us out of the mud. That's the kind of guy he was, and his men loved him for that, because he took care of them. You know, he got their mail to them. Oh, another thing I didn't mention in the presentation, they weren't getting paid, and he fixed the payroll system. So, you know, we loved him. Other questions or comments?
Is that your everyday attire?
No, thank God, because it's wool and it's hot. And I you know, this gave me a much more appreciation of these men down in the Carolinas or even Georgia or somewhere in July, August, September, 90-plus degree heat, 150% humidity, and they're down here in this wool. Oh, it's just, you know, I can't imagine. So
what would it have been?
it would have been, well, this would have been what they wore, yes. But I don't wear this every day myself.
No, I didn't mean you
Yeah.
today, but what would they have worn?
Yeah, they would have worn, the officers.
No matter how hot it was.
Yeah. Now, they may have stripped down to their shirt. They didn't have zippers and things like that. Everything was buttons. But, you know, they might have like this type of linen shirt. But depending on what they were doing, dictated what they would wear. If they were informal organization or parades or something like that, you know, they did the full thing. But if they were if they were in an attack mode, they would have on whatever was necessary for them to make that attack successful. Now, a lot of times, the guys in the heat of the battle, they would throw stuff away just because it was so heavy, and they would only keep maybe their rifle. And in panic situations, they'd throw everything down, including their rifles, and hightail it, which is unfortunate, but that's war. Other questions? So, yes, ma'am.
When the war began, did he enlist, or was he asked to?
He was urgently asked to come back because they had, like I said, around 1,500 officers at that time, total of about 7,000 men. Lincoln's first call up was for 75,000 men. Well, they ended up with, you know, 1 million plus by the time General Grant got promoted. And within 33 months, he was responsible for like 1 million men. So there was a rapid buildup, and they knew they had to have men like Rosecrans who had been through the military academy to help teach these guys how to lead and how to drill. There's have any of you seen the movie Glory? That's from back in the 80s. You might remember the drill sergeant when he's drilling the 54th Massachusetts, and the African American guys, they didn't know their left from their right. And so he stomped on one of them and said, "That's your left, and that's your right." That's the kind of thing that these officers were running into. Is, you know, these guys were just not knowledgeable about military etiquette or orders or discipline, and they had to ramp up very quickly. And the other thing they dealt with was a lot of the senior officers in the United States Army went for the South. So we lost a lot of brain trust when those guys left in the rebellion. And so that was another handicap that they had. So that's why they very quickly asked folks like Rosecrans, and I'm not even sure it was asking, it was more like, you know, kind of a drafting, because they had the knowledge that they needed. Yes, yeah, yeah. That the 43rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiment, and so there were probably a good 150 volunteer regiments, and how those would be instituted or implemented would be somebody, maybe a prominent doctor or a lawyer in the town, would try and raise the men, and in response to him organizing, they'd elect him captain, and then eventually he'd become the colonel. And again, you know, these guys didn't know anything about the military, so you had a lot of these volunteers, and the professional men were very resentful in some cases of these volunteers. In fact, there's at least one documented instance where a volunteer captain came in, and the professional soldiers, they were just privates and sergeants and things, were drunk and carousing around, and he gave them an order. And they said, "Who are you? You know, you're some volunteer to tell us." And that didn't go too well for them. So it was a little bit of a contention. But after about 2 years or so, the professional men started gaining respect for the volunteers after they saw them in service and fighting, and that, you know, these guys aren't just a bunch of rubes. They've become soldiers. So. You're quite welcome.
I would like to say before Michael leaves that, of course, this is our 250th anniversary of the U.S. Foundation and of the freedom. And Michael, as president of the Big Walnut Area Historical Society, writes a little bit of a column on their newsletter each month, and he has been writing the most wonderful short interest articles about the founding of the United States. And so if you go to the website for the Historical Society, you can read what he writes about America's founding, too.
And what we concentrate in those articles is what was going on in central Ohio during that particular month. So like this last month's article was what was going on in February of 1776. And wasn't a whole lot going on here at that point, but it got, you know, worse the further we got into the Revolution. So, thanks, Sherry.
Oh, sure.